Jeff Hallowell has been in the biochar business probably longer than I have, and one of the people I've worked with over the years. And we did a study tour last fall at his plant up in near Cornell. So if anybody ever wants to come up there, I'm sure he'd welcome them.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I'd like to thank the organizers as well. Yep. Thanks for saying that. How's that? A little better? Okay. All right. So my talk is on Scope 1 feedstocks. How many people here know what that is? Raise your hand. Okay, so about a third of you as well. So we've been doing biochar, as Kathleen said, since about 2010. And we started off doing pretty much Scope 3. And lately, in the last few years, especially since COVID, we've been doing mostly Scope 1. And so this is just some of our experiences and what we're hearing from our clients as well. So the greenhouse gas protocol has been around a long time, but when we started off in biochar, we were actually doing human waste, biosolids, and we were really focusing at that time on SDGs. So in the SDGs, if you're doing biosolids, it's about 14 of the 17, and we were really looking for impact at that time. And while greenhouse gas emissions was out there, this market really wasn't looking at it. Biochar market was kind of maybe something that would happen in 20 years or so, but it's kind of accelerated in the last few years, which is why I'm talking about it. So Scope 1 is our emissions that an individual is directly responsible for. So when you go down and buy a coffee downstairs, that cup, when they hand it to you, they've just given it from Scope 1, now you're Scope 2. When you throw it in the trash, you've just given off it's a Scope 3 now, and now it's the responsibility possibly of the city. So in any organization, they want to make sure that they're not counting everybody's emissions differently. So everybody has so they break it into different groups so that they're not double counted, just like we're not supposed to be double counting the carbon credits. So most people have seen this before, and it's basically, it identifies the Scope 1, which is for a corporation that they have to measure, and then the indirect as well, which is upstream and downstream, and they break that out into different categories as well. But what people don't see is that there's also one for cities. So for every individual and organization, there are many different scopes. And if you look in the greenhouse gas emission, there's more than a handful of different types of categories in how Scope 1 emissions. So every feedstock that you're producing is a Scope 1 for someone. The question is it a value to them, and is it helping reduce or meet their sustainability goals? California actually just recently came out with two bills that require that if you're over $500 million, you have to start reporting this. And if you look at the last one there, the Assembly Bill 1305, it's basically saying if you're claiming that you're a sustainable business and you are going to be net zero, then you have to report it as well. So that's a good thing for us. You'll hear that later on. And actually, South Pole, who's after me, has a really good webinar on their website for that as well. So there's lots of different approaches that people have had to greenhouse gas emissions, but there's really two that are really the most popular. And one is the avoidance strategy. So one client is basically saying, I'm just going to avoid these emissions. And then another one says, well, I'm an early adopter. I'm going to go out and buy some new technology, and I'm going to do some carbon removal. And so both of these, it sounds great, but when you really see sometimes how it plays out, sometimes it really isn't that practical. So, and we all have clients that probably are doing this. But there's really three base, and I'm glad we saw some this morning earlier in some of the other presentations, but I really like to look at it as there's three different types. The first one is the nature base or the natural climate solutions, which are things that are already out there. And actually, if you look at a lot of the literature, biochar actually plays into that as well as part of it, either occurring naturally or part of that process as well. And I had some information on the last slide of who it is, and I have some references at the end that you can look at as well. The next one is engineered systems, people who are actually engineering and building technology to do that as well. And biochar is in that category as well, and there's a lot of examples of that also. And then there's this hybrid, which again, biochar is in there as well, of different types of strategies of how to sequester carbon. And there's tons of different articles and journals that you can look at and how they classify them and how you can get credits for each of those. But emission credits really haven't been around just a little while. They've been around since '73 when the Clean Air Act came out. So it's over 40 years that emissions have been there. And so for our sister company, when a company goes out and gets a permit, you get a permit for 10 tons of emission. And then somebody else gets a permit for 10 tons of emission. If I'm under, and I only use 8 and you use 12, I could sell 2 of my tons to you and we would be okay. So we wouldn't get fined and we'd stay out of trouble. So this whole instance of trading and doing credits has been around in the emissions for a long time. It's not a new thing in this industry. And I'm also glad in a lot of presentations they're doing the concept of additionality, because we know that there's programs out there that are running that without the credits they wouldn't be viable. And so it's really important to be looking at that. And I think we're going to get under more scrutiny as we've oversold the credits right now and we've underdelivered. And so it's going to get tougher and tougher, I think, as we go along. To meet net zero, a lot of these companies are committing to net zero. That means they're committing to not buying any more credits. So I think that's another thing that we need to understand, that some of them have said by 2025 we're going to be net zero, or 2030 or 2050. But there is going to be an end to the credit sales as far as they're concerned, that they are going to have met their requirement and they're not going to buy any credits anymore. The other thing is looking at, net zero, absolute zero. Again, if customers are talking like this, then you know that they are trying to do some practices internally so that they don't need to buy credits long term. And then finally, Oxford offsetting. Again, basically the first principle is you have to spend the money on reducing your own before you go out and buy it as well. So these are all important things to understand, because there are two sides of the market. I think a lot of the talks are on the credit side, but there is a whole market there on the source one as well, which is a good thing for us. They also came out with this integrity initiative as well, where you have to publicly commit to net zero by 2050. So if you are looking at your business and the value of your business long time, and you have some really nice big customers, their goal is to not pay you anything by 2050. So you need to understand that as far as the value of your business long term. So why are they spending high amounts of money right now for carbon credits? Well, they're hoping to invest in the market so that we come up with technologies to reduce the cost so that they can help them meet their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions as well. And this is a survey that was done on CDR.FYI, which has some interesting information. One example I'll give you is the solar panels. When solar panels first came out, very expensive. Early adopters bought them, and guess what? The price went down. Because the volume increased, the technology got better, and now you can buy solar panels a lot cheaper than you could when they first came out in '77. The cost of biochar is also declining. There's lots of different markets that are looking at that. As these technologies are coming along, the price is going to go down. And so I think you have to be ready to be able to make it for $100 a ton, because that's going to be primarily the market. If it's not going to be in the biochar technology space, it'll be in another technology space. So my talk is really about how do you leverage that? What are the 3 ways to do that? So number 3 first is be everywhere as a hybrid solution. I think it's a missed opportunity that we should be looking at. So as Johannes mentioned this morning, biochar is the most popular, but people are investing in direct air capture. In fact, twice the rate of what they're spending in biochar. Also, they're spending a lot in cement and concrete, which again creates a lot of greenhouse gas. So it's important to look at where is the money, because right now people are saying, why are you doing credits? Well, that's where the money is. But that's not where people are investing right now, so I think you have to look at that. Or they're investing in it, but not to the extent that they are in some of the other technologies. And so this just outlines the difference. So it is about double being spent, for example, for direct air capture, which you could look at that Jersey cow and say, well, that was a great example of direct air capture, but they're spending a lot more money in some of those technologies. So in direct air capture, and we should understand all of the different removal technologies, there's 2 different kinds, solid and liquid. And guess what? They both need heat. The solid needs 80 to 120 C to run, and the liquid needs 300 to 900 C. So they need energy. They need thermal energy. And it's being said the same thing, that they're right now charging some pretty high dollars. I've seen $1,500 or even more a credit. But ideally, they're also going to be in that same category, that they're going to have to be down around 100 a ton by the same time. So how do they reduce their operating costs? Well, we have heat. They don't. We're doing scope 1 feedstocks. They're not. They don't have to move any feedstock. They don't have to secure feedstock contracts because they already got plenty of it. So I think looking at that and looking at those technologies and projects that are in your area and what do they need and how you could partner with them would be one good approach. Another one is I was excited to see Organic Recycle company downstairs, but that is going to be the new technology. In 2030, ORC is going to be very popular. It's going to be in a lot of trucks. It's going to be in a lot of cars. It's going to be kind of, you can go down to the auto parts store and buy it. So I would encourage you to look or invest in different types of organic recycle. Use this premium that you're getting for credits and use it to reinvest back in yourself to make your system more viable, because guess what? Power is a scope 1 problem for all the different groups that we're dealing with here. So number 2, be where the market is heading. And so where is that? Well, if you look at the scope 3 and you look at number 5 and you look at number 12. Number 5 is waste generated in operations, and number 12 is end-of-life treatment of products. So those are 2 areas that are scope 3. So they're kind of off the chart, and if you look back at the California, the corporations don't have to report that. However, if you look at the cities are now responsible. So now the cities have to report that because that's a scope 1 for them. The biosolids, the waste, everything, that is now a scope 1 for a city. In fact, for cities, 75% of the credits are actually with the cities because most of the waste and most of the emissions gets dumped to them. Landfills, other types of things that are generating greenhouse gases. Packaging is a big deal. Last year, Amazon shipped 6 billion packages. And I know when I get a box, it's a box in a box and sometimes 2 boxes in a box. So maybe 20 billion packages. Well, in some countries like UK, they're saying, that's your garbage, you clean it up. We're not going to spend money to get rid of that because 60% of cardboard ends up in the landfill. It doesn't all get recycled. So in Europe and in the US, we have producer responsibility laws. Right now it's for things like batteries and mercury switches and light bulbs, things like that. But they're starting to do it now for packaging. So in Europe, they're basically saying you're responsible for the end of life of your product. So if you look at those laws and see, is there a solution that we have that can help them meet that need? Because now that producer is responsible for everything that they're producing and sending out to the client because that city doesn't want to do it anymore. So I think some of the scope 3 emissions for corporations are going to come back to them as scope 1 because now legally they're going to be responsible for their product end of life. So corporate waste is in transition. So look at the laws that are happening, look at waste processing events because the pre-processing is completely different than woody biomass if that's what you're doing. So you have to be flexible. And sometimes they could mix it with woody biomass to be able to do it as well. So keep looking at that as well as a big market, which there's not a lot of cities here. There's not a lot of governments, but I remember there's some. I think Stockholm won. There's a lot of awards that Bloomberg and others have given to promote this in cities, but I think it's something that we're kind of missing. And then number 1, work directly with your customers and advisors on mitigation. And the reason is because most suppliers want to sell direct. And I think if you talk to some of the big ones, they're writing checks directly to those companies for the mitigation. But the same thing is happening with the sellers as well, as they want to deal direct as well. If you look at the CDP, which corporations report, the good news is that most people have a plan. So these large corporations that you're dealing with, you don't have to ask them what's your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. If you don't know what that is, or you say, Jeff, I don't know what you're talking about, the companies you're dealing with already have a plan of how they're going to do that. The question is, are you in that plan? Are you part of that strategy? The other thing is interesting is they're looking for revenue growth, whether it's consumers saying, hey, that's a sustainable company, I'm going to buy their product, or they're finding ways to cut costs or add value as well. So it's important to look at, are you a value on their balance sheet or are you an expense? Also work with accredited organizations. There's a lot of organizations that are involved in this market, but if you look at like US EPA, their site, they list the accredited organizations that you should be working with. Look at those, work with them. Most of the time, if you're doing scope 1, you're working with accounting firms because they're doing it's on the books internally. There's no registry, they're just declaring it. They have to have the proof, but it's more of a financial transaction internally rather than a public transaction. So build relationships and trust. Understand your customer strategy. They all do. A lot of them are looking for ways for help, and you can find out what that is. Also, in some of these markets, there's ISO standards now coming up of how different products are going to have end of life. If you're in those markets, you should be on those ISO committees and learning about the contents there, so you know that that is not going to be harmful for emissions, or it's going to not pass IBI standards for biochar as well. And then finally, make sure that you have a portfolio of 1, 2, 3 feedstocks, because if you don't, by 2050, you won't have any business, or maybe you'll sell your last credit in 2030, 2040 because you've got 10 years more to produce it. So that's important to note as well. And I do have here too, I have some additional resources and I can share later, and I have sources and citations if you are interested in any of that as well. Okay, thanks. Okay.
Questions?
Thank you. Great presentation. Eric Vargas, I'm with California Resources Corporation, the largest oil and gas producer and the future potential operator of the record capture hub in California. So you're absolutely right with respect to the investment of the record capture and where the investment is being going. But I do have a question, and really pretty much I think for everybody in the room. The record capture, as you mentioned, it requires a lot of heat. It's one of the main things that the record capture process needs. Why has not been any type of collaboration try to get those associated processes that have residual heat to benefit from maybe a pyrolysis DAC process that can maximize the carbon output of that project? So.
I agree with you. That's why I'm bringing it up. I think all of us should be working with other technologies because they all need energy, and most of them need thermal energy. So we should be doing that. That's the purpose of this talk, is that's where the money is. If you're following the credits, then you should be following the direct air capture. And if they need heat, you should be partnering with them in your location. And some of those technologies are only 10 ton per year. They're small, and there's some big ones that do, tens of thousands. But they all need energy, thermal energy and electricity to operate, because they run those big fans and then they heat up the process. So it's a perfect thing for us to be next to. So everywhere there's a direct air capture, there should be a system next to it or close by doing pyrolysis as well, because we have generally excess energy in all the things that we're doing, and we should be, and that has value. And I think in your life cycle analysis, you'll get more credit if you're using that heat. And some of the methodologies require that you use that heat. So how are you doing it? If you're out in the middle of nowhere processing wood that's dry, what are you doing with the heat? Are you making power? Are you selling it to another facility? So you need to be able to add value, because as the cost goes down from, some people are getting 1,000 or more a ton down to 100, you've got to get your operating costs down. Your capital costs are going to be covered, but you got to get your operating costs down. And if you're not combining it with other things to help them reduce it, then we're going to struggle, and we're not going to be able to make it. Good question, thanks.
I want to just add another opportunity that I see between direct air capture and biochar potentially is they're going to be building an awful lot of pipelines, and biochar has been shown to be an insulator in soils. It's also an absorber if there's leaks from oil pipelines. So it presents a pretty interesting opportunity to be used in that context as well. Any other questions?
Thank you. Oh, one more? Okay.
So the record capture is coming to, I think, to solve a lot of the issues that we have with pipelines, really, because as you process air, you can place these systems pretty much anywhere where you have a way to store CO2 in the subsurface, right? So it cannot solve the issue of the need for pipelines. However, I do agree that we need pipelines, but it's I think we as an industry everybody looking at the carbon needs to put the pressure into our government to pass, the comment period right now for SB, what is it, 905, and that right now is restricting the building any CO2 pipelines.
Jeff, do you want to say a little bit about your other projects since dairy came up earlier?
So we have 3 sites that we're doing processing of dairy manure. Dairy manure is actually very high in energy, has more energy than wood because the volatiles have, the odor is energy that you can use to process as well. And so it is energy balance positive. It is good for smaller farms. Larger farms, generally, if they have a digester, they've already sold their carbon credits. And so but they generally have sold half of them because usually it's for methane reduction, which they get at 50%. And usually Vera has done those, a lot of those. And so, but they haven't done it for the carbon yet. But the other thing is a lot of digesters need to be heated to 37 degrees C or 101 F, and they need heat too. And in the winter, a lot of these farms are using propane to heat their digesters. And so, again, we could use the thermal energy to combine with other technologies, like I mentioned, like digesters. A lot of these other technologies need heat to do. And so we're doing it. We have a couple different projects going on. And we do biosolids, we do food waste, we're doing a lot of textiles products, and one of our customers is here too. And textiles is another thing that's a big issue in landfills of what to do, what to get rid of. And a lot of it is, especially if it has natural fibers, can be pyrolyzed as well and used. And as producer responsibility goes to those vendors, they're looking, again, long-term at a strategy, saying, if this happens, what are we going to do? And so even if it never happens, they still need a strategy of what to do if it does. And so there is this kind of fear, uncertainty, doubt for that end of life as well.
Are you allowed to say what those textiles are? Because it's pretty unique.
Well, the customers are here; they can see. But yeah, it's absorbent hygiene products. So they throw about 40 million tons in landfills every year. It's about a $200 billion market, and they have no end of life strategy. So there's plenty for everybody. Thank you. Well, I'm also working on some biochar for pigment to use in replacement of carbon black. So I do think that is a big market. I think it's about $70 billion market, and a lot of things that carbon black are used for. As far as graphite, I don't really know. I'm not an expert, but I know there are some people in this room that could. Maybe Dr. Travel there has a little bit of experience in graphite right here, so you could ask him afterwards as well. And he's much smarter than I am. So, okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Biochar.org appreciates the support of our sponsors, exhibitors, presenters, and attendees. We look forward to seeing you at our next conference in September 2025.